Brace yourselves!
Konungahela 1136 Slavic maritime victory. It was a sea expedition of several hundred Wendish boats against a Norwegian port city, today's Kungälv in Sweden. There could have been as many as 660 ships, and each could carry 44 men and 2 horses. The action undertaken in 1136 by the Pomeranians under the leadership of Duke Racibor I ended on August 9th with a victorious battle fought near the city and the subsequent siege and destruction of the stronghold. The invasion of Racibor, called the Sea King, a vassal of Boleslaw Krivausti, was a preventive action aimed at preventing a war with the Margrave of the Northern March, Albert the Bear, who counted on the help of the Danish king Eric II, and was also a plundering expedition. Wends is a historical term for the Baltic Slavs, common to the Polabian Slavs and the Sorbs, who lived east of the Kingdom of Denmark, Norway, Sweden and in the area from the Oder to Gdansk. Currently used in Germany to refer to the Sorbian Serbs living in Lasatia. The history of this military expedition of early medieval Slavs from Pomerania was recorded by Snorri Sturluson, an Icelandic poet and author of sagas. His Heimskringla, Old Icelandic for the Circle of the World, was written between 1220 and 1230 and contains 16 sagas dedicated to the rulers of Norway. One of them, Magnus Saga Blinder OK Harald Gilla, the saga of Magnus the Blind and Harald Gille, in chapters 9 to 12 presents in detail the course of the Slavic attack on the Norwegian city of Konungahela. It describes details of military tactics and organization, the actions of various formations, the fleet, cavalry, infantry, and the prince's staff. The contemporary Polish equivalent of Snorri Sturluson, a historian and writer based in Berlin, specializing in the history of Slavs and Scandinavia in the Middle Ages, Robert F. Barkowski describes these events in the following words. At the beginning of August 1135,
Did you just
a
arrive from
powerful
that storm?
fleet, led by the Polish vassal, Duke of Pomerania Racibor, set sail, heading towards Konungahella, the wealthiest city in Norway. In just a few days, the Slavic warriors were to achieve a triumph the likes of which had never been seen on the Baltic Sea. They returned with fabulous loot, but also, with their honor tarnished. Snorri Sturluson reported that the invading fleet consisted of about 300 ships, each of which transported 44 warriors and 2 war horses. This would give a total of over 13,200 armed men, including at least 600 riders. The numbers are greatly exaggerated. Deducting the crews of the ships, servants and auxiliary forces, it can be realistically assumed that around 3,000 to 4,000 armed Slavs, including around 600 heavy horsemen, disembarked at Konungahela. We must also take into account the results of research by Swedish scientists who estimated Racibor's armed forces at Konungahela at around 1,000 foot warriors and around 1,000 horsemen. It is suggested that Snorri Sturluson simply multiplied the actual number of Slavic boats by 10. The Pomeranian-Polabian fleet, after connecting, perhaps in the vicinity of Rugia, set course for Scania and then north along the coast. After covering around 300 nautical miles in 2 Danish straits, the Slavic fleet arrived after 4 to 5 days of sailing, on the eve of St. Patrick's Day, Lawrence, or August 9, 1135, into the waters of Kattegat, at the height of the island of Hisingen. Dunamere and Unamore with some of their ships sailed into the main southern mouth of the Gota River. Steering against the current, with the island on their left, they reached the upper city of Konungahela, a fortified stronghold with a castle and a church. The second part of the fleet, led by Racibor, sailed into Nordra, the northern branch of the river, and stopped at the coastal piers. The further route was blocked by the bridge connecting Konungahela with the islet of Boas and sharpened poles driven into the riverbed to protect access from intruders. Racibor moored the ships at the piers and unloaded the cavalry, which then proceeded along the ridge of hills called Bratzes. The riders manned the land routes leading to the city. Konungahela was trapped, not yet knowing it. Einar, the son-in-law of parish priest André, hanging around the port quay, accidentally noticed the arrival of numerous boats. At first, it did not occupy his attention too much. After all, numerous units of traders and merchants were constantly docking at the piers built on piles. Only the sight of the sides of the boats covered with shields sharpened his vigilance. Einar ran as quickly as possible to the church, where his father-in-law was preaching. On the way, he noticed that cavalry units were approaching from the direction of the Bratzes hills towards the city. Einar rushed into the church, which was filled to the brim with the inhabitants of Konungahela, and informed them about the ships and the cavalry. Cavalry approaching from the hills. Most of those gathered in the church quickly came to the conclusion that the cavalry could only be Danish troops, led by King Eric the Memorable, coming to the rescue. However, an attack from the river must be opposed immediately. In a short time the people of Konungahela scattered to their homes, armed themselves and rushed towards the river. The inhabitants, having reached the shore and the bridge, found with horror that Einar had not exaggerated. The surface of the river was covered with a swarm of ships, hostile, Slavic ships. The battle was in full swing. Shortly before the Slavs intended to land their troops on the shore. Scandinavian ships began to sail out from behind the bridge connecting the shore with the islet of Boas. 1, then 2, finally 9 large, capacious seagoing ships that normally carried goods. At first glance, the merchant ships were in fact no worse than the ships, both in terms of equipment and crew. For the Scandinavian merchants, their daily bread was constant sea battles with Slavic thugs or the Baltic peoples who were engaged in robbery, who settled east of the mouth of the Vistula.
And what have you decided?
Fortune favors the bold.
What makes a king successful?
2 types of strength. Strength of mind. Intelligence. And the power to defend your position. Physical strength.
9 large ships, filled with numerous warriors, formed a line across the river and set off to clash with the Slavic fleet. Sudden war cries in a foreign language disoriented the Slavs who were leaving the decks. In the momentary confusion, before they had time to take their places in the ships again, the compact Danish formation struck with force. The roar of shattered hulls, screams and din. The first bodies hit from a distance by Danish arrows fell from the decks and drowned in the river currents. death took a heavy toll on the ranks of the crews on the first ships. But the surprise did not last long. The Danes did not break through and were stuck in one place. The Slavs began a counterattack. Bows and spears were used. And under the cover of shields, the Slavs tried to break into the enemy ships. When they did, a ruthless direct clash broke out. On the narrow river at this point, the Slavs had no opportunity to develop their forces or tactically use their numerical advantage. Only the ships standing in the first line participated in the direct clash. The crews of the others could only passively watch the fight and wait for the result. At that very moment, armed residents of Konungahela ran up. They immediately manned the quay and the bridge built of beams and began to fire at the Slavic ships packed together, throwing all kinds of missiles, arrows, spears, stones. The Slavs suffered great losses. Eventually, however, they managed to board one of the enemy ships and, after a fierce fight, kill its crew. Since the merchant ships were tightly pressed together by their sides, the Slavs now had an easier task. From the deck of the captured ship, they fiercely attacked the ships adjoining them on the left and right. As they pressed forward, the Slavs eventually took over all the enemy ships, slaughtering their crews. The surface of the river was covered with bodies of those killed in battle. The Slavs paid a high price for their victory, losing at least a dozen ships, definitely not the magic number of 180. As Snorri Sturluson reports, and many warriors, none of the Danes survived. At the sight of the defeat of their own merchant war squadron, the people of Konungahela panicked. The Slavs, under the cover of their shields, began to land their troops on the shore and the piers. The inhabitants on the bridge and quay stopped firing and hurried back to the city. Having scattered among the houses, they hastily gathered all the goods they could carry, especially valuables and money, but also weapons, and then in a group they headed to the fortified city. Seeking shelter there, after landing the men and war equipment, the Slavs began to inspect the army and count the dead. The losses were significant, causing anger among many. Under the influence of these moods and with the consent of the commanders, some of the warriors returned to the shore and began to empty the captured ships. Most of them rushed into the deserted city, plundering it completely of everything that the inhabitants had not managed to take with them. After all this, they set fire to both the Danish ships and the buildings of Konungahela. Thick smoke from the fires hit the sky, filling the inhabitants gathered on the ramparts of the city with fear. Before their eyes, the flames turned the city into a huge, hellish conflagration. The entire Slavic army now went to the stronghold's ramparts. At a safe distance, beyond the range of the defenders' missiles, the Slavs set up camp and began the siege. When everything was ready for the assault, Racibor first began negotiations. He proposed to the defenders that in the event of the stronghold's surrender without a fight, he guaranteed everyone the freedom to leave the stronghold, preserving their lives, weapons, clothing and all their property, gold, money, valuables. The defenders' reaction was unequivocal. They firmly refused. Answer the fight, the Slavs began the assault. The defenders, raising battle cries, took up positions on the ramparts and showered the attackers with a hail of missiles, arrows, stones, beams. The bodies fell thickly on both sides, although more on the Slavic side, which is no wonder. The Slavs stormed the high ramparts. exposed to constant fire from the defenders hiding behind the palisade. Two nobles from the surrounding estates, Sigurd Geidsson, Philip's brother, and Sigurd, came to the aid of nearby Skurbaga. Where news of the invasion had been brought, leading armed teams with a total strength of 720 knights and warriors. After a meeting, two groups were set out to aid Konungahella. Sigurd at the head of 480 and Sigurd at the head of 240 armed men. Sigurd's group was the first to engage in battle with the Slavs. In the very first clash, the Slavs destroyed the Norwegian shield wall, killing many of their opponents. Sigurd's unit was scattered and panicked. Sigurd managed to withdraw his decimated contingent from the battlefield, covering himself and his men with shame in the eyes of posterity. Soon Sigurd appeared on the battlefield with 240 warriors. At this sight, the Slavs again pulled some of their forces away from the stronghold and arranged them in battle formation. A battle ensued, in which the Slavs won a complete victory, killing all the Norwegian warriors, including Sigurd. After this episode, the battle for the stronghold was resumed with redoubled energy. Racibor, together with a group of advisors and leaders, watched the battle from a nearby elevation. The troops directly assaulting the stronghold's ramparts were supported by groups of archers positioned at a distance. The Slavs began to climb the rampart and capture sections on the palisade. The defenders withdrew to the stone castle, surrounded by its own wall. A particularly bravely fighting Slav broke through the enemy hordes and reached the very gate of the castle, blocked by a horde of heavily armed men. The Slav charged at them and with one powerful sword stroke split the Norwegian warrior standing closest. The defenders threw stones at him from above and showered him with a hail of spears. But they could not hit him. The Slav, throwing away his shield, wreathed, skillfully avoiding the missiles, and at the same time sowing death with his sword among those defending the gate. Pastor Andrei took a blessed lamp with fire and blessed an arrow with it, which he handed to Asmund. Asmund shot and fatally hit the heroic Slav under the gate. The Slavic warriors howled with grief at the sight. Racibor sent orders to temporarily stop the attack and called the commanders to a meeting. The council must have been taking place near the castle's defensive walls, because snatches of conversation reached the defenders. One of the Norwegians, fluent in Slavic, overheard and translated the words of Prince Unamor. The people defending the castle are proud and fierce in battle, and not easy to defeat. And even if we captured all their money and treasures, it would be a very dearly paid victory. We have already lost so many good warriors and commanders. But victory is near. Even this morning, when we began the siege, they hurled spears at us and struck us with arrows. Later, as the day wore on, they had only stones left, and now they are only chasing us away with sticks, as if we were dogs. I suppose from this that they have exhausted their means of defense. So let us make another assault, more violent than all the previous ones, and we will defeat them. Then we will take revenge for the losses we have suffered. Anamor was right, and the defenders of Konungahela were aware of this. They had run out of missiles for some time, and had even split the poles they used for throwing them in two. After a meeting, the Slavs began their assault. They fought fiercely, suffering great losses. On the Norwegian side, the commander of the garrison, Samund Husfroyer, fell in battle. When both sides, exhausted by the fighting, withdrew for a short break, Racibor sent another envoy, for the third time since the beginning of the siege, with proposals to surrender. Then those who remained decided to surrender the stronghold on the terms proposed by the Pomeranian prince. However, things turned out differently than Anamor had announced. The terms of surrendering Konungahela, although honorable, were not kept. The quoted text is a fragment of Robert F. Barkowski's book entitled Konungahela 1135. It was published by Bellona in 2020. A short text in the Kolobrzeg Museum Gazette summarizes the finale of the siege as follows, although short-term negotiations were undertaken, according to which a ceasefire was to be concluded and the invaders dismissed for a generous ransom. As soon as the last gates of the Swedish center were opened, the Pomeranians showed no mercy. Those of the inhabitants who, due to low birth or physical reasons, were deemed incapable of surviving the journey back to Pomerania were killed on the spot. The rest were taken prisoner. Racibor's warriors also took all the money and objects of any value. Snorri Sturluson wrote the following words on the pages of the saga entitled, "The Circle of Light." Racibor returned to Slavia, and a large number of the people who had been taken from Konungahela then lived for a long time among the Slavs in captivity. The great port never returned to the same state as before. Indeed, the rebirth of the famous port was to take place only at the beginning of the 17th century, and only a few kilometers from the place of fighting, in the shadow of the Boers fortress. Its history as an important trade hub definitely came to an end after the plunder of 1136.